In exercises 1 to 4, we did 4 different standing pole postures, and these helped us to understand conceptually and physically balanced whole body unified force. And remember, there's no fixed method, so the Ichan method is infinitely creative, infinitely adaptive to different needs, different capacities, or different approaches. So we needn't necessarily do it that way. That's just the way that we're doing it in this series. Next, I want to kill a few birds with one stone. So the first thing we want to do is start to move, to start to take those standing pole postures and transform them into movement. Extend the feeling that we developed of balanced whole body unified force into slow movement, which is usually called Shili in Mandarin. So the first thing that we want to do is to maintain that sense of balance and then begin to move, maintaining the same feeling of whole body unified force and critically holding it in balance. And that's not as easy as it might seem, particularly for people who are a little bit more advanced in Yiquan, because more advanced Yiquan is primarily based around unbalanced whole body unified force. And I know that sounds a little bit abstract at first, but it's exactly the same concept as a jab in boxing or a cross, or in fact any punch in boxing uses unbalanced force. And the idea always in martial arts is, can you control that unbalance, infect your opponent's structure with it in a way that they find difficult to manage or control? If so, you win that exchange. And we're going to talk about infecting your opponent's structure with unbalanced force, which sounds gross, I know, but that's the technical language we're going to use. We're going to talk about that a lot as the series progresses, because it's the essence of each one in many ways. But for now, the critical thing is to experience the difference between balanced and unbalanced whole body unified force. And we need to do that across a few videos, but we can start by a very simple exercise where we do the same exercise more than once, but using different kinds of visualizations to, first of all, experience movement in balance and then movement with imbalance. And what we're doing here is building the foundations, the absolute fundamentals of hitting with Farley or using Farley and guiding force in each one as a distinct concept. So I know, as I've talked about before, it's a current vogue to say that anything that hits with power is Farley, but that absolutely isn't how Wang Xiangjai understood this concept. And he specifically makes the point that even if you hit with power, if you don't follow the quintessence principles of Wushu, it isn't Farley in the way that the ancients understood it and in the way that Wang Xiangjai himself understands it. And it's worth just reminding ourselves here that the way that Wang Xiangjai understands the Yiquan method is that it has 2 core ideas. One is to get you to as high a level as possible, as quickly as possible. And the second is longevity. So not training in a way that damages you long term, training in a way that allows you to keep training, hopefully for the rest of your life. And one of the key practical applications of that idea is working on the absolute fundamental basics of movement in a way that doesn't damage the body. It doesn't do long-term damage. So this is a good example of how the Yiquan method sees the same ideas reappear at different points within the curriculum. In this case, the idea of working on fundamental movement quality rather than just trying to somehow bully the body into getting it right. So a good example of that is the way we think about using a punch bag in each one. We don't just start hitting the bag as hard as we possibly can, hoping that by doing that somehow we'll bully our body into stacking the structure in the correct configuration to develop real power. Instead, we start hitting the bag light. And I've mentioned before Sui Ruibin, Yao Zhongzhun's student, saying that this was like a revelation to Western boxing coaches, this idea that you could do this when Yao Zhongzhun was talking about it to them. You hit the bag light, and that gives you the ability to just check your structure. Actually, if you hit with correct structure, even when you're hitting light, you get a very different effect to when you hit with poor structure. And by building up from that foundation, you can save your body an enormous amount of wear and tear, and also get there quicker. So even though people really want to hit the bag with power straight away, it's fun and it's a stress reliever. Nevertheless, for real professional development, you start hitting the bag light and you build, and you're patient and you're diligent, and that way You save wear and tear, you get there quicker, and eventually when you do hit with power, you've got correct structure. And this is exactly the same concept with slow movement. It's just that slow movement is a stage before even that, a stage before we even start trying to hit the bag. We're working on much more fundamental concepts of movement. You can absolutely get these things by different means, different methods. All martial arts are using the same principles of wushu, i.e. the quintessence core contexts of open, close, rise and sink. All martial arts use those. And in particular, all forms of Chinese wushu use those. They're the absolute core quintessence principles of all forms of wushu. So this isn't just a method for what we might call Yiquan. And this speaks to this idea of Ichan evolving into a science of wushu itself. So these training exercises are for anyone doing any kind of Chinese wushu, in fact any kind of martial arts or any kind of sport, because not just martial arts use these ideas of open, close, rise and sink. They are what we call the four contexts, and although I'll come back to this at another point, I can mention now that what we're doing when we use balanced whole body unified force is called the fifth context, or what is sometimes called hold the center. It's the real meaning of the idea of hold the center. And in the old wushu terminology, the old coded language, that would be called the earth element. So earth is the thing from which everything else comes from, so hold the center. And from there you skew the posture into either open, close, rise or sink, and that really covers everything. And it's not just in Chinese wushu. Miyamoto Musashi talks about this idea, calls them the five attitudes, and says, I assure you, no matter how complex the style seems, there are ultimately only five attitudes, or we would say five contexts. And these are how Wang Qianjai's key concept of leverage expands into physical movement. And we'll talk about that obviously in detail at another time, over a few videos in fact. I mean, it's the foundation, so we'll talk about it multiple times. But I wanted to mention that for quite a long time, people who, let's say, have been grasping at straws one way or another at key concepts around each one have come out with all kinds of theory about how power should be generated, about what Fa Li is and so on, and about what Wang Qianjai actually taught. And one of the problems there, I think, is that people outside of China haven't had access to good quality translations of Wang Qianjai's works. But now people can. Through AI, anyone can go and get good quality translations. And the words may have changed a little bit over time because the translations aren't always accurate, not because of the translations themselves, but because, as I think Hansi Huang, Wang Qianjai's student, says, Wang Qianjai was so creative, he didn't always have the terminology, he didn't always have the language to express the ideas that he was understanding, that he was unfolding from the infinite curriculum. And so sometimes the words that he uses aren't necessarily the most appropriate term. So I've mentioned leverage, which when he says leverage, he doesn't mean leverage in terms of like a martial artist like doing an armbar. I can't remember if I've already said that. He means leverage in your own body, how you leverage one part of the body against another, i.e. in open, close, rise or sink. He also talks, for example, about rebound energy, and that's what we would now call setting a posture. And he describes in detail exactly the same thing that I've described throughout the beginner series and the intentional movement series and the art of rooting series, setting a posture and what that is and what it does. The words are only important if they're misleading. So rebound energy is a little bit misleading. It makes people think about the wrong kind of thing, whereas setting a posture is a much clearer scientific idea. And sometimes he doesn't even have a word for the concept that he wants to get across. And a really interesting case is hit and stop. And we've talked about hit and stop multiple times throughout the beginner series, and it's a key concept in how we use striking in each one. I'm not going to rehearse what that is now. And we're going to come back to discussing it, of course, because it's so important. But Wang Qianjai himself says it's absolutely the most critical, fundamental concept that he's trying to get across to other people. But he doesn't even have a word for it. All he can do is describe the method. So we give it the term hit and stop. In any case, what I'm emphasizing here is there's been people talking about all kinds of mystical stuff. I'm not by any means dismissing the idea of qi. It's how we think about qi, or what part in the training process I mean, there's all this stuff about Wang Qianjai abolishing the idea of qi. My understanding is he did start to think like that, but he was still using the idea of qi well into his 70s, and most of his students use the idea of qi. But he certainly doesn't use this idea of some kind of exotic force, which is sometimes associated with the concept of qi. as the means via which power is generated in each one. He gives very clear, distinct and straightforward descriptions of the mechanical use of the body, particularly around this concept of leverage. And that's very much what we're going to look at in these exercises, how we begin to train leverage, or we should really say skewing the posture. We should use the most appropriate word, skewing the posture, and the way that we set the posture, the way that we use rooting in the posture to help us generate force. And of course, what everyone is really interested in is how we really use Fa Li. And there's no shortcuts. This is the shortcut. So I know everyone always wants some kind of secret thing, some secret manual written on a turtle shell, as Wang Xianjai says, but this is the shortcut. We just build it step by step, stage by stage, like this. Diligently. It takes time, it takes a lot of cultivation, but eventually we get there. In any case, what we're going to do is we're going to take each of those standing pole postures that we looked at in exercises 1 to 4. We're going to do each one separately, and we're going to extend the movement. So we're going to extend the feeling, not necessarily along the same vector that we worked with when we were doing the standing pole postures themselves. That's just so that we can get variation. Otherwise, we'll be doing the same things for each exercise. And I'll break it into 4 different separate videos, which would hopefully make it easier for people to follow. And I'll describe what we're doing, particularly in each exercise, in the videos. What we're going to do, there'll be 4 sections. The first section will be just working on movement with the arms. So using visualization that I will describe in those videos to help you just maintain balance and just focusing on the arms and the chest and the back area and keeping that in balance, just keeping it as easy and as simple as possible and holding balance. So not skewing the posture in any way, not twisting at the spine axis, not twisting at the quad axis. Remember all those old Xing Yiquan manuals, in fact Tai Chi Chuan manuals, Bagua manuals, they all talk about this idea that the key essence is how you integrate the spine axis and the quad axis, what we can more scientifically call the horizontal axis and the vertical axis, because, for example, as I've talked about before, the spine axis isn't really along directly the line of the spine. It's to do with where the centre of centrifugal force is, which isn't usually in line with the spine. Keeping it in as absolute balance as possible, so not skewing it in any way. And then in the next section, I'll demonstrate the difference, like the visual difference when somebody uses more advanced movements, so skewing the posture left and right. What I'm doing there in those exercises is playing with open, close, rise and sink in the same posture. So you can see the difference between a balanced posture and a posture that's playing with imbalance. And for more advanced practice, that isn't just a matter of imbalancing it one way or the other. So we can think about the difference between, well, what we're talking about is single and double weightedness, but I don't want to muddy the waters too much. So we'll come back and talk about Ichan's concept of single and double weightedness and how it refers to this concept of the difference between shifting between balance and imbalance. But at a more advanced stage of practice, you'll be shifting rapidly between one and the other and shifting rapidly between different contexts. And this is because, for example, imagine if you're doing push hands, you've got to rapidly change, play with open, close, rise and sink, moving very rapidly from one to the other, trying to catch out or feel the other person's balance and then infect their structure with imbalance. And you do that not just by, for example, using open and trying to push your way through, you shifting between open, close, rise, sink rapidly, just trying to trick the opponent or just somehow get the upper hand over their balance. And that's exactly what you'll see in my movement. I'm shifting open, close, rise and sink even within these basic postures. And that will just help to give a visual cue as to the difference between balanced and imbalanced posture in exactly the same posture. And that also helps us to understand, all these exercises help us to understand how much can actually be going on within stillness or within slow movement. There can be so much work going on with the internal mechanisms of the body. So that will be part 2 of each video, and then in part 3 we'll return to using a completely balanced whole body unified force posture. So it's still exactly the same posture, but this time we'll be trying to integrate our whole structure into the movement, not using any kind of skewing. And here things get quite interesting because, well, there's a lot going on with balanced whole body movement. for the most part, it's not the thing that we need for martial arts practice, and that's why it tends to be emphasized a lot more in Ichan practice for health. Actually, you don't have to just use balanced postures in Ichan for health. For one thing, you need to be able to design postures to help address particular kinds of physiotherapeutic needs, but we'll come back and look at that another time. And for this reason, very often more advanced practitioners tend to disregard balanced practice because it's not that useful for actual fighting. But actually, when you circle round back again to look at balanced movement, there's a lot that can be going on in that kind of training that's really useful. So one of the things that we'll look at there in those postures is just a very elementary form of thinking about how we activate the legs, the whole structure, into a balanced posture and what that feels like, and we'll do some visualizations for that. And then in the fourth part of the video, we'll do exactly the same posture, but we'll bring in a completely different visualization that will allow us to start skewing the posture. And we're going to do incredibly basic visualizations for this, incredibly basic exercises that start to help us to understand how you bring into basic postures this kind of fundamental internal work. And when I say internal in that sense, I don't mean internal force, I mean internal forces, like the mechanical forces within the body. And again, there's so much disinformation that's been put out there over the decades about what Wang Xiangjia was actually talking about. But anyone can go and check now. Wang Xiangjia talks in detail about this kind of work, that this is what he's talking about. And I mean, it's not just a coincidence. If you want to actually hit with force, you need to be able to root and set the postures and skew the postures in a very particular kind of way. If you want to be able to do the kinds of things that I do and also be able to do them in your mid-50s like I do them, this is how you do it. And Wang Xiangjia explains this in detail. It's just an unfortunate part of the overall Yiquan scene as it currently is at the moment that there's so much disinformation that's obscuring the truth. Even the truth as Wang Xiangjia actually wrote it, it's been completely obscured by this. But nevertheless, this is the method, this is how it's done. And even though these are really basic exercises, so what we'll be doing in effect is just doing the balanced movement, but then emphasizing a skew. So one arm pushing against one leg, just using the internal mechanisms of the body, even though we're still doing the same movement with the other half of the body. And this will help us to understand how we can use our intent to highlight and pick out different parts of our body and link them together, and actually how curious and difficult that is to do that. And it will also teach us something very interesting about the relationship between intent and physical movement, and that liminal space where, well, we're not clear, is it physical or is it mental? And remember that whole body unified force is in the programming. In fact, all movement is in the programming. We just access it through physical movement and try and rewrite that coding. And the way this works is through what we call cultivation. So every time you do an exercise like this, it rewrites the programming a little bit. But then when you stop doing the exercise, imagine that coding just reverts, or most of it reverts back to the coding that you had before. And by coding in this sense, we mean the way that society has trained your body and intent to function. So you do it again and it rewrites the coding a little bit again, and then when you stop again, it all reverts back again. And this is why the process of cultivation has to be done over longer periods of time. You've got to keep doing it until those, well, what's the buzzword now, neural pathways or something like that, until they get rewritten. Remember, those are all metaphors. Rewriting neural pathways is as much a metaphor as chi meridians. But whatever it is, whatever metaphor we use, we're rewriting that ability to use our body in a specific way. So cultivation is just rewriting it again and again and again and again until eventually it begins to stick. I'll explain all about that in the actual videos themselves. I have to say, I found some of this quite difficult going back and doing all of this again. I'm so used to just working with skewed whole body unified force that working with balanced whole body unified force actually was quite difficult, even though in theory it's a much more elementary level of training. And that was useful for me. It taught me something. And I found myself doing odd things, like when I was supposed to be doing the whole movement but just focusing my intent on one half of my body, I stopped doing the movement on the other side of the body. And so all kinds of things like that going on, which highlighted to me areas where I need to go back and just recheck my training, or just, as Confucius says, revisit those basics, see them again in a different way. And finally, I'll say you don't have to do this kind of training amongst trees. I'm quite happy doing this kind of training in the gym. It doesn't bother me. But Wang Shenjai says do it amongst trees if you can, to benefit from the way that trees emit oxygen and take in carbon dioxide. But there again, he also says benefit from ultraviolet radiation. And I think that's a bit of advice that didn't age very well. And neither did the people who followed that advice, I should think. But it is nice to get outdoors and train outside. The flies were horrendous though, so something quite interesting happened. The horse flies were buzzing me, so there's a few moments where I just kind of release force from my head. It's not my Tourette's. I'm just trying to get the horse fly off in the... I'm doing it now as I'm talking about it. Talk about intense influencing movement. Trying to get the horse flies off me. But after about 4 or 5 minutes of practice, they stopped bothering me. So they were absolutely swarming me at first. And then when I started doing the practice, they stopped bothering me. So answers on a postcard, please. Maybe my chi just repelled them. But it is nice to get outdoors, wherever gives you that sense where you can really focus. So remember, this isn't Qigong. And all of the old Yiquan masters emphasize it's not Qigong. It breaks away from that kind of concept of using particularly breathing, so timing movements to breathing. You can't do that in Ichan. So one of the things you should do here is try and do the movement really, really slowly. That helps to rewrite the code in much more detail. It's not Qigong. It's very mechanical in a way, but also focusing on the intent. So shifting between different kinds of emotions. I like to shift emotions with the changing of the light. So when it goes darker, I like to just move with that and kind of just bring out that kind of more warrior spirit, if you like, where the more intensity in the movement, in the intent, and then when it goes lighter, that's where I'll tend to smile and just try and bring out a more joyous sense to what I'm doing. So just working with and moving with nature. But I don't have any problem working with these kind of postures in a gym or a crowded environment. But it is tough, it's hard work, and you can also think about different vectors. So I'm just explaining the outline of the training concepts as we move from balanced whole body force into unbalanced whole body force. But think about different vectors that you could work with and different visualizations that you could use.